Yeah, Mrityunjay, is it because we are going on live? That's why most people have not joined?
So most of the people are there on YouTube as well as Facebook Live, I guess.
Okay, okay, that's the danger. That's the danger. If you go on live, normally people, they tend to be there on Facebook and so yeah, I mean in just couple of more minutes we can start. So how much time, ma'am? You said 20-25 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll speak for 20-25 minutes at most. And
Yes,
then,
yes, yes. And Amitabh, you also can take 20-25 minutes.
Sure.
Yeah. So, and I read your piece in, I think that was in Asian Age, Amitabh. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
And ma'am, I think your piece was there in HT, which actually, when we discussed, when we were having this, that we need to have one in Ukraine. So when we discussed immediately, I mean, your piece and you came to our mind, and I thought that no, you'll be the best speaker. And incidentally, that evening you were there on NDTV. So,
yeah.
so we thought that yes, of course.
Yeah. I wrote in Hindu also and in several.
Yeah.
Several, yeah.
So, Mrityunjay, I think now.
Let's start.
Yeah. So we are of course near half century. Around 50 of us are there. So I think that's fine. We can start now.
Yes.
Mrityunjay.
Yes, sir.
So we can start. I think because we are here almost 50, and 50 right, and it's increasing. It's like the votes in the
Yes, sir.
election results. So and yeah, so formally now we can start.
Sure, sir. So BA Program, Department of Ramjas College welcomes you all to the last and the most edifying and educational session of day one of Sangam 2022. Today we all have gathered here virtually as the conditions are improving steadily but are not at the best. So we can for once assume our rooms to be the auditorium of the prestigious and one of the founding colleges of Delhi University, the very own Ramjas College. Our college had the privilege of being inaugurated by Mahatma Gandhi in its early form and by Dr. Rajendra Prasad in its present form. It's a pleasure to be the part of the institution where renowned names like Baba Sahib Ambedkar, Martin Luther King Jr., and many more were associated in some or the other way. The college and the BA program department has a long history of producing and molding great minds into great personalities. Someone has very well said that knowledge is like a garden. If it's not cultivated, it can't be harvested. So to cultivate and augment the area of our knowledge, I now request Kapil to let us acquaint with the topic of discussion and the seminars. Over to you, Kapil.
Thank you, Mrityunjay. Hello and good evening, everyone. The most burning issue in today's geopolitics is the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. The war, being rightly described as a probable trigger to the Third World War, is causing huge losses of lives and property. Russia is being sanctioned by the rest of the world for its invasion of Ukraine. So today, the topic of our seminar is, why does the Ukraine war go on? Now the thing is, why are we discussing this issue? India and we Indians are also directly and indirectly affected by the crisis. Directly, as thousands of Indian students were stranded in Ukraine and the government had to evacuate them as soon as possible, which it did through the Operation Ganga. The war is indirectly affecting our economy and causing hyperinflation in the markets. So, to discuss the issue and give us the details of the crisis, today we have the most apt speakers with an expertise in the field of the Russian and Central Asian studies. Professor Dr. Anuradha M. Chenoy is a retired professor and former dean of the School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. She is the former chairperson and area studies director of the Center for Russia Studies and has written many books, monographs, and articles like the Maoist and Other Armed Conflicts, 100 Years of the Russian Revolution, Re-Emerging Russia, among others. Also, to discuss the issue with us, we have Dr. Professor Amitabh Singh, Associate Professor at Center for Russian and Central Asian Studies, and School of International Studies, JNU. He specializes in the Russian-European identity and international relation theories. He also has an experience of over 19 years in the field of teaching and research. So without taking much time, I would like to invite Professor Dr. Anuradha Chenoy to give us the minutes and an expert opinion of the issue. Ma'am, over to you.
Tanveer, Ejaz, friends at Ramjas, I'm indeed very honored to be here to discuss this very critical issue of the war in Ukraine. I would say that in the very beginning that we must all condemn this war and any other war. War leads to humanitarian crisis. It is not a solution, and nothing can be solved by war. However, we should explain the war, why it is going on, and add our voices to ending such wars, this war and other wars which have gone on. So now, why does this war go on? Who are the parties to this conflict? Clearly, it is Russia, which is the aggressor, of course. But in this war, there has a conflicting rationality, interest, and narrative that is similar to a death-like grip on each other. Second, each party favors force over compromise, so no compromise is being reached. Third, each party is privileging state and regime security over people's interests. Fourth, each of these parties has their own form of militarized nationalisms competing with each other, and each of them is committed to capital and financial oligarchies in their own ways. So in a way, my understanding is this is an aggression between two kind of imperialist powers, imperialist in different ways, which I will can explain later. Another thing is that this is a war really like the last century. It's like a war, part of the old wars that the world had before 1918 with an unstable multipolar system that some great powers will not accept. So who are the parties to this war? And the very reasons why the war continues is also why the war is not stopping. One, Russia. Russia sees the expansion of NATO into Ukraine as an existential threat. Because their argument is that if there are NATO missiles in Ukraine, 5 minutes of striking distance from major Russian cities like Moscow, they can be destroyed. NATO's 20-year expansion and its push, since especially in 2008, to invite Georgia and Ukraine, not invite in the sense, give a signal to Georgia and Ukraine to join, broke down the confidence that Russia had for years of hoping that there would be some kind of détente between them and NATO. So the Russians believe in the need to destroy the Ukrainian military infrastructure and force it into some kind of neutrality before NATO uses Ukraine to undermine it. So this is their one argument. Their second argument and rationalization is every war requires a rationalization. We in the peace movement believe, nothing can rationalize a war, but we have to explain the rationalizations. Second is the issue of the Russian ethnic minorities and their secession from Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is, has a huge, very long border with Russia, and it's almost like the India-Nepal border, very porous. People go and come, go across it all the time. And it is a very emotional and geostrategic issue also for the Russians, because a lot of Russian ethnic minorities live on that border area, especially in the Donbas region and earlier in the Crimea region, which seceded in 2014 and rejoined Russia. It was always part of Russia since centuries. When Russia disintegrated, it became part of Ukraine because Stalin had given it to Ukraine in 1956. But by 2014, they had a referendum and they said, we want to secede. And with the help of the Russian army, they seceded from Ukraine and joined it. After that, there has been a civil war in this Donbas region for the last almost 8 years, and a lot of people have been killed here. Civil war between mainly the secessionists, backed by the Russians, and the Ukrainian army. So that was a second reason. The third reason is also Russian nationalism that Putin represents. He believes that in Slav and the ethnic Russians, the Slavic is our one nation, and he has even challenged Ukraine's sovereignty and nationhood, which is completely a violation of international law. But nonetheless, these are the reasons that Russia has given it for the war, and they do not want to withdraw until at least they get two of these. That is, Ukraine gives a written legal undertaking that it will not join NATO, and two, these seceded small republics of Donetsk and Luhansk and Crimea should be safeguarded, and their independence should be recognized by Ukraine. The rest of the world is unlikely to recognize it. Second, now about Ukraine. What is their reason and their nationalism for not compromising? One, of course, is that before, till 2014 almost, Ukraine saw Russia as an ally. They were dependent on it for oil and gas. They're heavily indebted to Russia. Russia had a lot of investments there. But after Crimea seceded, and then there was an Orange Revolution in Ukraine, backed by the US, where the pro-Russian president Yanukovych was overthrown, and a very anti-Russian president and very right-wing presidents took over one by one, and now you have Zelensky. Because East and West Ukraine are quite divided. The west part of Ukraine is very pro-Europe, and they want to be part of the EU. And now all of Ukraine does. So Zelensky refused to compromise, and he is pleading for a quick entry into the European Union. He's also asking for an entry into NATO. NATO has said they cannot allow him currently, but the EU is definitely considering it and fast-tracking his application, even though it's a process which takes a very long time, and Turkey has been waiting for 12 years to become part of the EU, and they still have not, and they're unlikely to be. So Zelensky really is now part of this Ukrainian nationalism, this underground and overground movement to push Russia back, but there has been no compromise reached, even though there have been a number of talks which have been going on. Third party to this conflict is really the US as a leader of NATO. The US is in a deep struggle to retain its hegemony and advance its military-industrial complex globally. The US views Ukraine as an opportunity to curtail Russian economic and political and military power in Europe and globally. Many years ago, Kissinger had argued that Ukraine was a key to Russian power in Europe, and if it is, if that relationship is broken, then Russia will be crippled. Many American strategists have said that bringing NATO into Ukraine will draw Russia into a war, and it's dangerous for Europe, the NATO, and the world. But people like George Kennan and Mersheimer have argued that expanding into Ukraine, NATO coming into Ukraine is very disastrous. But Biden has refused to listen to these strategists. In fact, they are being called anti-American to some extent. And they are pushing for, they have actually needled Russia a great deal. They've had military and strategic exercises with Ukraine. They're giving a lot of arms, weaponizing it, billions of dollars worth of arms. And they have made a new military base in Poland, which is 100 miles from the Russian border. So the US is interested in retaining its presence in Europe, and Russia has provided the opportunity. The fourth party to the war is actually also Europe. It's embedded in its own security dilemmas of NATO partnership and historical experience. It did try some compromise. They had the Minsk agreement in 2014 and 15, that is Germany, France, Ukraine, and Russia, in which they said that this civil war, these provinces which are going in for civil war and secession, they should cease hostility. There should be a 15-kilometer line of contact that they called it, but they're weaponizing Ukraine massively, and they're re-weaponizing Europe. And they're changing its laws to give more Germany, for example, to give more military assistance to Ukraine. So now NATO is quite divided. The kind of autonomy that some of the countries had, like France and Germany, are back in the American fold. So my next question is then, who benefits and who loses in this war? One, Ukraine is the biggest loser. Its economy and infrastructure is destroyed. It is flooded with weapons. It will be aid dependent for decades. There are 2 million refugees, and its only gain is its collective nationalism. It could become part of the EU. It will have international sympathy, but it will be on its ears and will take years to rebuild. Second, Russia will only have short-term gains. It will show its military prowess and show it is willing to go to any extent to safeguard its core security interests. They could succeed in dividing Ukraine into some of the eastern parts, could be kind of semi-autonomous or independent, and it will stop it from joining NATO for 20 years, but it will not help in the long run. In the meantime, with Western sanctions, the company sanctions, in a period of globalization, the Russian economy will deeply suffer. Even though they've been preparing for this war since 2014 at least. They have the world's greatest gold resources and etc., very low debt, but nonetheless, they have resources like oil and gas, and other countries can bail them out to some extent, but long time they will be an international pariah blamed for this war, and the West is going to keep encircling them. Of course, the EU is also going to suffer, in the sense it's going to be more dependent on the US. It's going to be more militarized. Fortress Europe will develop. They've taken 2 million Ukrainian refugees. They will not want any more, especially from West or South Asia, if they have conflicts. And they have a human insecurity crisis. And the sanctions on Russia will also impact them seriously. But because they take about 25% of their gas is dependent on Russian gas. The Nord Stream 2 project will be on hold, so they will also lose. The country which seems to gain is the United States. Their role as a hegemonic superpower has been revived, or at least that's what they wanted to do. We don't like hegemonic superpowers, but that's what their aim and ambition is, so they've got their ambition. They have re-established some of their credibility, which went on account of that poor defeat from Afghanistan. But that credibility is mixed. Europe has probably forgotten Afghanistan, but the global South will not. Then second, their aim that NATO is emerging as the only leading exclusive military alliance. So the US dream of extending its power over land, sea, space, and technology is stepping up. Third, they control the narrative, security narrative in Europe and in multilateral organizations. They've had a diplomatic win in the UN, even though many countries like India, etc., 40 countries abstained, 10 African countries did not come. And most of the global South is neutral, but I don't think they're concerned about that as long as they have the liberal and security narrative over Europe. So no country can really challenge their soft power or their internal democratic model, where wherever there are oppressions, people want to migrate to the US or at least copy their model. Fifth, their military industrial complex is thriving and will increase its manufacturing to export capacity as sanctions on Russia will grow and more countries will diversify their imports, taking in the US arms. Six, their security contractors will rebuild Ukrainian in a new militarized economy, and that's where they are. It's full of their private security contractors already. Six, their only worry is the Indo-Pacific and China, where the geostrategic competition will grow, and it's actually growing, and that will be the next target of the US. As Europe is one, West Asia is demolished and outsourced. And of course, the biggest losers are people from all over Ukraine, Russia, the global south, Europe, etc. The losers is climate, ecology, the loss for the planet. So basically, a peace treaty is the only way out. Now, my last point really is what is the position of the global south? It was evident in the UN Security Council that while many countries of the global south voted for the UN resolution, a few countries like just 4 countries, Singapore, Japan, Kenya, and South Korea voted along with the US in condemning and having sanctions. But other countries, even when they condemned or they abstained, they're basically taking a position of neutrality. Amongst those who abstained, of course, was China and all the BRICS countries, that is Brazil, India, China, South Africa, 28 countries in Africa, that is 18 abstained, 10 did not come, Mexico, Venezuela, all of South Asia abstained. All of Central Asia opposed the resolution. Vietnam abstained. So there were, the South is being very cautious and neutral, I think correctly. And the reasons for this are very clear. One, of course, is their national interest, which is the trade that they have with Russia, the oil and gas imports, the defense imports, etc. Second, the global South does not see Russia as a threat. They were not colonized by the Soviets or by Russia, and they recall that role in the decolonization movements. They see a continuity of post-colonial policies and racism, in fact, from Western actions. So also Russia has given unconditional development assistance to a lot of countries in the global South. And they have also given assistance to them during NATO interventions and bombings. So they believe, and also the next reason why much of the global South, including India, is neutral, is they believe that Russia has genuine, legitimate security interests which need to be accommodated by the EU and by NATO. And they feel, and they've said that no country can tolerate either this isolation targeted by missiles on their border. So they are saying that any peace treaty must accommodate these legitimate security interests. Further, the global South believes that they have witnessed that the US has not been interested in a diplomatic solution. It has an agenda of maintaining hegemony. It has provoked Russia, it has taken advantage of Ukraine, and it is having a proxy war in the Ukraine. The US rejected the diplomatic proposals of Ukraine being a neutral zone, like Finland and Austria are, and has only assisted Ukraine in providing arms while it doesn't want any of its own soldiers on the ground. Also, that could lead to an expansion of the war. But they do not want, nobody wants a third world war. So it is a war in Europe, a war restricted between Russia and Ukraine, where others are very smartly staying out, but supporting their own side, except the global South, which is neutral and is constantly calling out for a diplomatic solution. As far as China is concerned, there are a lot of questions about China, but China has shown, at least rhetorically, that Russia has serious concerns. They are opposed to NATO expansion to Ukraine also, but they're calling for back to the table diplomacy. Xi Jinping had talks with the French and German leaders just a few days ago, calling for back to the table and some kind of compromise. It's in their interest that Russia remains stable and powerful, because they believe that if Russia is weakened, China will be next. Of course, China will gain with the sanctions, because Russian oil, etc., will go to China. They'll be more dependent on China. But Russia and China are very strong strategic partners, and they would like Russia to be stronger. The last point about India. India, as I said, has, they believe this is a confrontation between the US, Ukraine, and Russia, and they do not want to take anyone's side. They want also a diplomatic solution, but they don't want to condemn Russia. India's defense, hydrocarbon, trade relations cannot be jeopardized. And also in an unsettled, non-normative, multipolar world, India sees a lot of uncertainties, and it has to tread the tightrope. Of course, India will be deeply pressured by the US, but I think they will continue to remain neutral. So lastly, really, I believe I can say my own position is that, similar to the many peace movements, where I believe that we should all call for an end to all wars, call for peace and stability, try to strengthen regional and multilateral organizations like the United Nations and others. That is what our position should be, just like we condemn the wars in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Libya and Afghanistan, and the NATO continued their bombings. We oppose those, and we oppose this also. So thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am, for enriching our knowledge. Now I would request Professor Amitabh Singh to further discuss the topic and add more value to it.
Thank you, organizers. Thank you, Dr. Ejaz. Dr. Ejaz, am I right? You are now a PhD. Congratulations for you. Congratulations to you for your PhD, and especially Professor Anuradha Chenoy. It was like going back 3 decades into her class when we were her students, and occasionally I was going back on those past 3 decades where she explained the topic with such thorough knowledge and insight. So thank you very much, ma'am. The problem in social sciences has always been, especially in political science, that when you speak towards the end or you're the last speakers, you have nothing much to speak because everything else is already spoken about. I've been asked by Dr. Ejaz to speak in Hindi also, so I'll try and do that in Hindi also. I'll take my cue from Professor Chenoy, where she started with condemning the war. जब उन्होंने युद्ध को पूरी तरह से नकारा और ये कहा कि युद्ध का कोई अस्तित्व होना नहीं चाहिए. Youth should not exist at all. And the requirement for peace also requires that, wars be outlawed. But in 21st century, 21वीं शताब्दी को कभी ऐसा नहीं सोचते थे कि एक युद्ध होगा जो 19वीं शताब्दी और 20वीं शताब्दी की याद दिला देगा, जहां ट्रेंच वॉरफेयर होगा, जहां राइफल से और मोटर से लड़ाई किया जाएगा. तो युद्ध सचमुच एक डेस्पिकेबल एक्ट है, चाहे वो कोई करे, चाहे वो कोई करे. भुगतता कौन है? हम सब देख रहे हैं. We are all seeing. It's generally the children, the women, and the other, people who cannot be part in any way of the war machinery. Now, what every student wants to know, especially graduation students, that what went wrong? What went wrong between US, Russia? What went wrong between EU and Russia? What went wrong between NATO and Russia? And things like that. So now the basic premise of my argument would be for the next 15-20 minutes on how things have panned out in Europe, especially in terms of Ukraine and Russia. You know, Ukraine and Russia are the same people. वो एक ही लोग हैं. मतलब उनकी भाषा, उनके धर्म, उनका पहनावा, उनकी कल्चर, उनका आउटलुक टुवर्ड्स द वर्ल्ड, सब बराबर है. अगर आप देखें तो वो किसी भी तरह से रूसियों से किसी मामले में कम नहीं, चाहे वो उनकी हिस्ट्री आप खंगालें, सेकेंड वर्ल्ड वॉर की हिस्ट्री, तो जितने रूसी सफर किए हैं उससे कुछ ज्यादा ही यूक्रेनियंस ने सफर किया है. तो उनका इतिहास ये बताता है कि युद्ध जो है एक विभीषिका तो है ही, it's a bane on society, but besides being a bane on society, it also tends to bring to the fore many sores that have not been healed over the years, you know. But अब जैसा कि देख के लग रहा है कि वो इतने ही क्लोज हैं, they are as close as probably we are in India, that, you know, they are the same people, Indian and Pakistanis. Russia and Ukraine are similar in a way that, you know, they share the same history. You know, the history of the Russians, if you see, started with Kievan Rus. You know, the people who belonged or who owned the area around Kiev, and the origin of Russian people, it can be traced back to Kiev itself. So Kiev is at the center of Russian civilization, modern Russian civilization, if I might say. So war has unnerved not only Ukrainians, but the entire world. Why it went, what went wrong, क्या गड़बड़ हुई, क्या ऐसी स्थितियां पैदा हुई जिससे युद्ध की स्थिति आ गई. You know, 90 के दशक में अगर हम देखें, और इसको मैं पावर पॉलिटिक्स से ज्यादा समझता हूं. अमेरिका रूस संबंध, चाहे वेस्ट एंड रशियन रिलेशनशिप या यूरोप एंड रशियन रिलेशनशिप, बिकॉज, यू नो, when we try to understand Russia being in Europe, we must also try to understand that Russia has always been the other of Europe. You know, सबने सुना होगा ओरिएंटलिज्म एडवर्ड सईद का. ओरिएंटलिज्म को उसने दिखाया है कि कैसे नॉन वेस्ट के बेसिस पे वेस्ट अपना एग्जिस्टेंस बनाया है. मॉडर्न वेस्ट जो है, अगर 20th सेंचुरी वेस्ट अगर हम देखें या उसके पहले का भी वेस्ट देखें, तो उसकी पूरी आइडेंटिटी जो है यूरोप की तो है ही, लेकिन एक वेस्टर्न यूरोपियन की आइडेंटिटी है जो रूस को यूरोपियन नहीं मानता है. कई मामलों में रूसियों को कई सालों तक बर्बर कहा जाता रहा. They were barbarians, they were not civilized people and things like that. But 90s was a tumultuous decade in the Russian history and in the history of the region. You know, for the Soviet Union disintegrated, and what came out of Soviet Union, well, all of you know, it was 14+1 Russia, that as a state it came out. Initially, when the Soviet Union broke up, there are three states, especially Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. These were the three founding, states which started having interactions and talks about whether to, restore Soviet Union, not Soviet Union in the same form, in the same communist dictatorial form, but उसका एक ऐसा स्वरूप बनाने के वो चाह रहे थे जिसमें सोवियत यूनियन की जितनी खामियां थी उसके अलावा एक अच्छा विश्व बनाया जा सके और एक अच्छा ईस्टर्न यूरोप और रशिया का इंटरैक्शन बनाया जा सके. हालांकि उसमें बहुत सफलता नहीं मिली. 90 का दशक हम सबको पता है, जब बोरिस येल्सिन वहां थे तो कई सारे प्रॉब्लम थे वहां, और कई सारे लोगों ने वहां जो प्रॉब्लम झेला उसके चलते इकोनॉमी उनकी बहुत बिगड़ गई. और इकोनॉमी का ऐसा नहीं था कि सोवियत संघ के विघटन के बाद ही इकोनॉमी बिगड़ी. सोवियत संघ के विघटन के पहले भी उनकी स्थिति बिगड़ती जा रही थी 90 के दशक में. खासकर अगर हम देखें तो उनका जो सबसे बड़ा प्रॉब्लम क्या था कि उनके पूरे सप्लाई लाइन, सप्लाई चेन्स डिसरप्ट हो गए. जैसे यूक्रेन इज वन ऑफ द बिगेस्ट प्रोड्यूसर्स ऑफ wheat in Europe. You know, Ukraine after Russia is the biggest state in Europe also. So all the bread making factory, for example, were based in Russia. Similarly, you know, Ukraine had nuclear missile station on its territory, but the nuclear control button was in Russia. You know, so there were several practical problems which these nations faced, but notwithstanding those, all these three states were, you know, fiercely looking for a common identity, a common space within the European architecture, security or economic architecture. And you know, the 90s was also the time when the West promised that Russia would be given a chair on the high table on which they sat. You know, post 1990s, you know, at the start of the first decade of 21st century, Putin, all of you know, in 2000 came into power. Putin came at the back of power at the time when the oil prices had started rising. You know, as Professor Chenoy earlier also told that, you know, Russia is one of the biggest producer of gas and oil. 26% of Europe's requirement of petroleum products is given by Russia. Around 40% of gas that's used for heating homes in European Union is given by Russia. So that way, Russia is a economic superpower when it comes to you know, hydrocarbon reserves. But in many ways, if you try and understand what went wrong between these two states was at the start of 21st century, you know, there was an unrest in Georgia. आप सबने सुना होगा, जॉर्जिया एक राज्य है साउथ कॉकेशस में, जो कि एक छोटा राज्य है, इकोनॉमिकली बहुत एडवांस नहीं है, बट इन मेनी वेज अगर जॉर्जिया को भी अगर हम देखें तो जॉर्जिया एक ऐसा राष्ट्र है जो साउथ कॉकेशस में है, जस्ट बियॉन्ड द कॉकेशियन माउंटेन्स, बट यू नो देयर वर टू टेरिटरीज सेपरेट व्हिच वर सीकिंग सेपरेशंस फ्रॉम जॉर्जिया. दो राज्य थे, दो रीजन थे, राज्य नहीं रीजन थे, जो जॉर्जिया से निकलना चाहते थे, जिसका सोवियत संघ के समय से ये डिमांड था कि वो इंडिपेंडेंट है, ऑटोनोमस है, और वो ऑटोनोमस थे भी, जैसे साउथ ओसेटिया जो है वो autonomous tha within Georgia in the former Soviet Union also. So they were looking for this Ossetian identity and Abkhazian identity. You know, Russia intervened, all of you know, in 2008, and there was a 5-day war in which the Russians defeated Georgians very badly, and that was kind of, you know, a transitional phase that had started with the coming of Putin into power, with the turnaround in the economy that started in the first century of this century, first decade of this century, you know. So in many ways, Russia had drew the ire of the West by attacking Georgia, you know, by trying to meddle into the internal affairs of a sovereign state. And mind you, why did Georgia had a war with Russia? क्यों एक युद्ध हुआ जॉर्जिया का रूस के साथ? अगर हम देखें तो जॉर्जिया वो एक पहला राज्य था जिसने यूरोपियन यूनियन और नेटो की सदस्यता दोनों चाहिए, अपार्ट फ्रॉम द बाल्टिक स्टेट्स, जो बाल्टिक राज्य हैं, गणराज्य हैं तीनों, लाटविया, लिथुआनिया और एस्टोनिया, जिन्होंने 91 के बाद ही कहा कि मुझे कोई कुछ लेना देना नहीं है पूर्व सोवियत संघ के किसी राज्यों से, हम पूरी तरह से वेस्ट यूरोप की तरफ देखेंगे, नेटो की तरफ देखेंगे, और नेटो के और यूरोपियन यूनियन के सदस्य भी बन गए. उस समय येल्सिन का काल था, जो उस समय अपने आप को असर्ट नहीं कर पा रहे थे, लेकिन जॉर्जिया जब यूरोपियन यूनियन की सदस्यता मांगने लगा और नेटो की सदस्यता मांगने लगा, तब सबसे बड़ी प्रॉब्लम क्या हुई मैं बताऊं कि इस समय अमेरिका ने उन पर बहुत जोर दिया कि किसी न किसी तरह वो नाटो का सदस्य बन जाए, यूरोपियन यूनियन के सदस्य बन जाए, लेकिन एक रेड लाइन पुतिन ने ड्रॉ किया कि आपको इसको क्रॉस नहीं करना है. अगर आप क्रॉस करेंगे तो आप अपने you are inviting your own peril, you know. तो उस तरह से अगर देखा जाए तो 2008 का जो युद्ध था वो पहला एक ग्राउंड बना वेस्ट का कि वो अमेरिका का खास करके कि वो रूस को इस हाई टेबल से जो उनका चेयर उनकी कुर्सी लगी है उसको अलग करे। और आप सबको याद होगा G7 जो कुछ दिनों के लिए G7+1 था वो G8 बन गया था, लेकिन G7+1 का वो आइडेंटिटी जो +1 की थी वो 2008 से 2014 तक रही। और फाइनली क्रीमिया के युद्ध के समय हम सब ने देखा कि 2014 में G8 से रूस को बाहर कर दिया गया। लेकिन जो समस्या रही, जो इंटरवेंशन जो वेस्ट चाहता था कि वो करे और यूक्रेन को शायद नेटो और यूरोपियन यूनियन का सदस्य बना सके, उसको लेकर भी काफी बातें हुई। 2014 में ऑरेंज रेवोल्यूशन, हम सब जानते हैं कि एक कलर्ड रेवोल्यूशन का कॉन्सेप्ट आया था फॉर्मर सोवियत यूनियन के रीजन में, जहां वैसे राज्य जो रूस को का समर्थन करते थे या रूस से जिनका दोस्ताना व्यवहार था, रिलेशन था, उनको ये कहा जाता था कि CIA या वेस्टर्न यूरोप या वेस्ट के राज्य किसी तरह फंड करके एक क्रांति, एक पॉपुलर रेवोल्यूशन कराना चाहते हैं ताकि वहां की रूलिंग पार्टी को, वहां के रूलर्स को अपदस्थ किया जा सके। ये उसका एक बहुत बड़ा इंपॉर्टेंट बेंचमार्क था कलर्ड रेवोल्यूशन का। और कलर्ड रेवोल्यूशन ने क्या किया, उसका असर हम सब जानते हैं कि क्या हुआ। जॉर्जिया में जैसे रोज रेवोल्यूशन हुआ तो उस समय के जो शासक थे उनको हटा के एक नया शासक जो प्रो वेस्टर्न शासक था उसको लाके बैठाया गया। तो जाहिर है पुतिन को और रूस को ये भी डर, जो रशियन एलिट्स हैं उनको भी ये डर लगने लगा कि एक कलर्ड रेवोल्यूशन कहीं रूस में ना हो जाए, और रूस जब उसको फेस करेगा तो वो भी कहीं यूक्रेन और जॉर्जिया की तरह प्रो वेस्ट ना हो जाए और उसकी पूरी लेगेसी जो है एज एन इंडिपेंडेंट पावर, एज एन इंडिपेंडेंट स्टेट, वो खत्म नहीं हो जाए। तो ये भी एक बड़ा तकरार का विषय रहा है रूस और वेस्ट के संबंधों में। बट the problem started after 2014. For the past 8 years, both Ukraine and Russia have been preparing for a major war. And in terms of psychology also, if you see both these people of both these states, they are psychologically prepared for a long drawn war. It's not going to be a simple war. And all the media reports that you see that the people are not prepared, or Ukraine was not prepared to risk a war. When it was risked with a war, people of Ukraine would surrender. Russia thought, that's my hunch, that the war will go on for long, and Russia is now getting prepared for that. The media reports that are coming that when you have a state like Russia as your enemy, and you are at the receiving end of such a mighty power, you can only wait and watch. Because the way that the Russian army is moving in Ukraine, you will realize that it's not that Russia cannot overrun Ukraine in few days or few weeks. No, it can very well do that. But Russia is also very clear about what has to be achieved. It's not the capture of territories. Unfortunately, in modern era, in 21st century, the capture of territory, all of us know the expansionism cannot hold for long. It has to stop somewhere. And expansionism, all of you know, that has never worked, not only in 21st century, but in 20th century. But the role of USA and NATO as a superpower or as a power needs to be probed further if you try to analyze the Ukraine-Russia war. Who is to be blamed? Is it only Russia who is to be blamed? The blame game has to start. Who's to be blamed? Is it, USA always looks for a excuse, always looks for war or one dispute or one controversy or the other in the world to legitimize its rule, to have, as Prof. Chenoy said, the hegemonic control over rest of the world. That's what it has done. Starting even during the Cold War, you will see the Vietnam War or the intervention in Afghanistan. You will see all these superpowers, both USSR and USA, have been looking for excuses to expand their hegemonical control over the rest of the world. And what has happened in Vietnam, we have all seen that Vietnam was a blunder that USA committed. 79 onwards, USSR, when it intervened in Afghanistan, it was a wonder. It was a blunder that they committed. But at the end of the day, expansionism never worked. USA, especially if you try to analyze, wherever it has entered, be it Iraq, be it Libya, be it Afghanistan, they have completely finished the whatever remaining democratic or economic infrastructure that any state had prior to invasion of these states. They ditched the Kurds, if you remember, Tanveer, in 2020, Trump simply dumped the Kurds because they were not very good as an opponent to the ISIL, people. The bottom line that America is always looking for, it's always looking for a conflict or a conflict-like situation where they can impose, or through their illegitimate actions by sending arms and other things, they can control the situation that they are in. What is happening in Ukraine is also very pathetic. Every household now has small arms with them, something that which was there in Afghanistan and Iraq. Every house has a Kalashnikov rifle or a mortar launcher, or the emphasis now is on on the selling of arms. For example, Harpoon missiles, Scorpion anti-tank missiles, they are being distributed to civilians with minimum training that they are given. So what will happen to Ukraine, even if the war ends, that only time will say. But all the more, जो सबसे बुरी बात है इस entire process में, कि more than Russia, it's the West that has behaved very irresponsibly. अगर रशिया को युद्ध करना था, नहीं करना था, 1.5 महीने पहले से एक ड्रामा शुरू हो गया था कि 15 फरवरी वो डेट है जब रूस यूक्रेन पर अटैक करेगा. यूक्रेनियन खुद कह रहे हैं कि अटैक होने वाला नहीं है, ये मुझे डराया जा रहा है, ये एक नॉर्मल सिचुएशन चल रही है जिसको आगे बढ़ते देना चाहिए, लेकिन वैसा हो नहीं रहा है. So I'll try to wind up here by saying that, as Professor Chenoy started by saying, war is always illegitimate. There is no just war. The concept of just war in military studies and international relations is a sham. There can be no just war. The problem is how you see the elites of Russia and Ukraine, especially today. Zelensky is seen as hero in the Western world. All of us know that heroes are not the people who are decided by the journalists or by the newspapers, current affairs newspapers. Heroes are decided by history. I know for sure that Putin would not be seen as a hero, especially after this war ends. But I'm sure history would also judge the way Volodymyr Zelensky has behaved, the way that he has incensed the people of Ukraine and the entire Ukrainian nation to enter a war, which probably would have no result, and even if there are results coming out of it, it will be disaster for both Ukraine and Russia. Thank you, Tanveer. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Amitabh, and thank you so much, Professor Chenoy. I request Mrityunjay to do the question answer session, or shall I? Shall I go ahead with the question answer session?
Sir, as you like it, either you can moderate it.
Okay, so let me do that.
Thank you.
I mean, wonderful insights into the Ukrainian crisis by both Professor Chenoy and Professor Amitabh. And it's really, I mean, more you discuss, and I think more the questions are coming up. And every day developments which are taking place, we are seeing new perspectives also coming up. But yes, I mean, as Professor Chenoy said, that there are certain things which at the foundational level we have to understand, particularly in terms of how states interact with each other, and international relations. Of course, there are interests, and at the end of the day, we need to work for peace. Peace, of course, is very important. And there's no justification for war. There's no rationality for war. War is as I understand, it's an evil impulse of human being, and of course, we need to do away with this evil impulse which originates somewhere in our mind, basically to acquire more, and war, of course, has in the background, has something to do with material reality, has to do something which, the way how at the global level the surplus is accumulated, and how you try to garner, your groups in order to to either further capitalism or to advance the capitalism. So I think it's a war which needs to be seen within capitalism, how capitalism is also taking its detours. There are a few questions, of course. I think Professor Chenoy said that Amitabh, if you could take some of the questions. The first question is by Vandana. If Vandana, if she's there, if she allows me, I can read the question. Can one say that it's a war between Ukrainian democratic and individual freedom versus authoritarianism? So this is a question. I think any one of you can take it, and then shall I read all the questions, and then of course you can divide, or question by question, we can sort of discuss, because this, perhaps I understand, Q&A is the most exciting session.
Can one say that it's a war between Ukrainian democratic and individual freedom versus Russian authoritarianism? War is a war is a war. You cannot say that it's a war. When you read international relations students of graduation, democratic peace theory, when we read democratic peace theory, it is said that, democratic states are less prone to war. But, don't you see that even Russia is a democracy to a large extent? Yes. So in the scale of democracy, if it exists, Russia is as democratic as, probably Ukraine or any other states. All these post-Soviet states, you will see, are ruled by rulers, who have had no previous history in politics, especially, Volodymyr Zelensky. If you see, all of you know that he was a stand-up comedian, a television actor, a very popular star in Ukrainian television. Even prior to his presidentship, there was a president called Petro Poroshenko. He is a billionaire, he is a chocolate king. So the leadership in former Soviet Union, in most of the states, are people who rule through their instincts rather than political maturity, right? And if you call them democracy, I mean, fine and good, but, Russia is authoritarianism, or Russia being understood as an authoritarian state is when you try to impose the Western standards of a democracy in such states. Russia is as democratic as any other state, of Europe, but the war is a war, and that war needs to be seen. Neither, Putin should be seen as a dictator, or Zelensky should be seen as a democrat. Zelensky, in my understanding, is as much responsible for a war as probably Putin is, and that needs to be stressed. What is the next question?
There are a series of questions in the chat box, but I see that Professor Chenoy has answered those questions. But if you want to pick up, Amitabh, any one of those questions,
can you just because I was not, I didn't read, because I'll have to read it afresh.
Okay. So, you
can choose any question that.
Yes. I mean, the question that is this war a fight for regional dominance or Putin's ambition to re-establish USSR? So it's a very, very general question which comes to everyone's mind, that is it going back to, because talking about nationalism, is it going back to the then USSR time period and trying to establish that, or a sense of loss is there, when this whole split was there? So what is this war basically? So I think you
see, Russia has been an imperial power. It has been an overland imperial power for say 700, 800 years. It has had the biggest overland empires in the world, probably till the Second World War, 1917. Till the Russian Revolution. So there is an air of imperialism in Russia, which is already there. But it cannot be blamed only to Russia. What is US doing there? Or tell me, to put it in another way, what is the relevance of NATO today? Can anyone say why NATO exists? NATO was a Cold War phenomenon. It should have ended with the Cold War, just as Warsaw Pact ended. Why did NATO need to expand? And what was the enemy? Who was the enemy? That enemy was created by NATO. That enemy was created by USA. In this process of creating an enemy and otherization, who was the victim? It was the Russians. Russia was the victim, right? It had no other thing to defend. When you push someone to the wall, if you push some state to the wall, with the might of NATO, you have 27 states coming under one umbrella, one roof, to probably wage a war. And if not war, collective security doesn't mean that if you are attacked only. And even if you attack the NATO power, where does NATO figure in European security architecture? Because every other state in Europe is within NATO. So if NATO exists, it needs to have an enemy. The enemy naturally has to be Russia, because it was the only state that was left out. Much of the NATO's security architecture or the European security architecture revolves around thwarting Russian influence in Europe and in the world, right? So it's not only Russia that has to be blamed and always blamed for things. Russia is also not without friends. I'm not defending in any way Putin or his war machine. Russia has its own friends, mind you. Even within Europe, the entire Central Asia, South Caucasus states like China, arguably are also friends of Russia, right? So the war, when it started and war when it will end, it's not only Russia's role would be questioned. It would also be the NATO's role. EU's role of individual states like Germany, France would come into question. All of us know that European Union is an economic union, is a trade body, or it's states coming together to downsize their tariff or eliminate their tariff barriers. EU for the first time has sanctioned $300 million to arm Ukraine. That was not the philosophy with which European Union was formed, right? The founders of European Union never had this in mind, because European Union was formed to settle the territorial disputes largely between the European states, especially between France and Germany, right? The remilitarization of Germany, there are many ifs and buts there also, but remilitarization of Germany, where it will lead to, right? And the outcome of the war would be much anticipated. Those of us who were thinking that 21st century war would be different war from the 20th or 19th or 18th century wars. If the wars are still the trench warfare, if wars are the same mortar and missile firing warfare, then we need to relook at our defense spendings, our military trainings, and standing conventional military forces that we'll have. So in 21st century, many things will be shaped by this war or the turn of events that happens after the war.
Yeah, so I think we'll just pick up one or two more questions and then we'll wind it up. Vandana again has a question. I think she says, how do you decide whether NATO is offensive or defensive? This is for you, Amitabh.
Do you know the history of NATO, Vandana? NATO was an aggressor in the former Yugoslav Republic. It went against UN's resolutions and attacked Serbia, attacked Kosovo, bombed the Chinese embassy in the late 90s. And US said, and the NATO said that, we are sorry that we did not intended to bomb the Chinese embassy in Serbia, but it happened by mistake, and we take full responsibility. But why was NATO in Afghanistan, right? Was it a defense force in Afghanistan? Was it not an armed intervention in Afghanistan? So if you see NATO as defensive, and I'm sorry, you have not understood the plot. The NATO is a military machine, has a huge military budget, has huge armaments, and naval frigates and things like that at its disposal, which can destroy any state in the world at any given point of time. So it's not defensive. Carrying a revolver around your waist, is that a defensive act when a person who's standing next to you does not have anything in his hands or on his waist? Merely having a revolver is not a defensive, it's an offensive act. It impels your neighbor, the person standing next to you, also to have a revolver, right? So defensive can only be when you disarm or give an undertaking that, we will not fight war. That has not happened, right, Vandana?
Yes. I think there's no more question left. So probably anyone, if anyone finally wants to the last question, I can. And of course, let me put a very, very straight and simple question to Amitabh. So is China the next hegemon?
What I fear in, this post-COVID world would be an entirely different world. Not only in terms of, public health scares that happen, but also because the new security architecture that's framing up in the world. It would be like post-1945 world. So what my hunch, an informed hunch, is that Russia, China, together along with their minions in different parts of the world would come together, where Russia would be kind of giving a security or a nuclear umbrella to these states, and China would be would partly play the role of IMF and World Bank and trade balancer or economic balancer among the states, just as Russia would be balancing the security among the states. This would be, in quite opposite or contrast to the new security architecture that is shaping up in the so-called Indo-Pacific and in other parts of the world, AUKUS, Quad, and things like that. So you also have a West Asian Quad. Even the West Asian politics is also, all of you know, is in for a big change, huge change, in terms of the new Ottomanism that Turkey has now embarked upon. So earlier during the 20th century, we had larger states like Saudi Arabia, Israel, probably Iran, who were the power centers in the West Asian hemisphere. But now you will see Turkey also playing a bigger role in Europe, in the South Caucasus, and down below in the Gulf world. So this will be an interesting times where Turkey, China, Russia would come together to counter a so-called democratic world with not so democratic world led by Russia, Turkey, China, and others. Tanveer.
Thank you so much, Amitabh. I think we, all of us, are really enriched by the end of the talk. At least we now have some sense of what exactly is happening at Ukraine. So thank you so much. And Professor Chenoy and Prof. Yes.
I mean, things are going offline. Why don't you also go offline in terms of interaction, human interaction with people? At Delhi University colleges are going offline in terms.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
Kind of inanimate discussion.
Yes. Because we are going offline. We have started, but since this was perceived in this way, and because of so many issues, finances, etc. So of course, we thought to go online.
Finances can be taken care of because we are already being paid by the university system.
Yeah, that's right. So definitely. Yeah, definitely. Next time, of course, we would like you and Professor Chenoy to listen face to face, and of course that is much better than. So thank you so much for giving your valuable time to Ramjas, and I'm sure that you have some affinity to Ramjas because you were sometime associated with Ramjas some point of time. So that's great. And yes, Kapil, if there is some official or some formal vote of thanks, or Mrityunjay, is there some vote of thanks? Yeah.
Yes, sir. So it's our immense pleasure to have all the speakers and the audience here, turning the seminar into a successful, interactive, and engaging session. The Department of BA program would like to thank the speakers for making all of us the part of their knowledge, and the listeners for being patient and being the part of the seminar on such a short notice. I also extend my heartfelt gratitude to our respected convener, Professor Tanveer Ejaz, co-convener, Professor Mausmi Bose, and all the other faculty members for making today's session more productive and successful. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.